Fembe bedogo nyama bekoro nyama bedogo la fenko.
Thank you, Tony, for this nice introduction, and thank you all for coming, and thank you, Jeff, and the Political Science Club, and Corey, and Ellie, for putting this event together, and thank you for the Political Science Department to give me the honor to deliver the inaugural lecture of the Amin Kazak lectures. I didn't have the privilege of working with Professor Amin Kazak, but when I entered my office for the first time, like a couple of weeks ago, I found that he had left me boxes full of books and videotapes about the region, which was just a clear sign of what kind of a great and thoughtful colleague he was for everyone in the department, and a great teacher he must have been for his students. My talk is going to be about the historical roots and future prospects of the current crisis in Egypt. But before I move to my laptop and start going through the slides and videos and pictures, and to talk about the historical roots, let me start by talking about the immediate cause of the current crisis. Western media has portrayed the immediate cause, or has portrayed the military intervention on July 3rd as the immediate cause for the current crisis in Egypt. I have a different view. I believe that the immediate cause for the crisis wasn't the military intervention. The military actually had to intervene at the end, but the immediate cause was actually Morsi's refusal to go to early presidential elections as the people requested, or to even have a referendum to see whether people wanted him to stay in office until the end of his term or not. He insisted on refusing this popular demand, even after millions of people took to the streets on July 30th, and the army gave all political forces and all political actors, including Morsi, a 48-hour chance to actually reach a political solution, basically to go to early elections or for a referendum. Morsi came out on TV and delivered a speech, Egyptian TV, and delivered a speech in which he stated more than once, he repeatedly emphasized that he was willing to die and to sacrifice his blood over going, that he preferred to sacrifice his blood over going to early presidential elections. By making this statement on June 30th at night, it became clear, and with the millions of people on the streets, it became clear that if the military wasn't going to intervene, that we're going to face a civil war in Egypt. So this one comes to the immediate cause. Now, why did, and now I move here, and I hope I'm not, Egyptians take to the streets requesting or demanding early elections? Basically, aside from the fact that Morsi's performance as president and the performance of his government was really like miserable, it was more the fact that his rule was pretty undemocratic, and that the Islamists, not just members of the Muslim Brotherhood, but other Islamist groups, resorted to tactics of terror and used tactics of terror against Egyptian citizens. I'll share with you a couple of videos. This is a video, and please notice the date here. This is in December of 2012, like almost 6 months before he was toppled. At that point, Morsi had issued a decree basically shielding his decisions against judicial scrutiny, and when people took to the streets to protest it at the presidential palace, he actually unleashed the members of the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm not talking now about police forces, I'm talking about members of the Muslim Brotherhood. We're talking about something that is similar to militias against the protesters, and the protesters got tortured at the gates of the presidential palace, and this is what I'll share with you now. These are, by the way, the gates of the presidential palace. This was happening at the gates of the presidential palace, with like all of Morsi's aides and like advisors and everything inside the presidential palace. So basically, the Muslim Brotherhood supporters are telling them, admit and confess that you were paid by the former ruling party to protest. They keep saying protect him. The guy was wearing black. These are the gates of the presidential palace. This guy was, beaten really bad because they found out that he was a Christian. And the main argument that the Muslim Brotherhood was making that the majority of the protesters were Christians. Who paid you to an attempt that happened on the life of the current Egyptian Minister of Interior Affairs today in the morning. There was an attempt to kill him, to assassinate him, with, I believe it was a booby-trapped car. They insist that they were paid to protest against Morsi and they want him to confess. They're telling him it's better that you admit now before they take you inside and you're going to get killed inside. Inside they're talking about the presidential palace. Kid also. Kid was also beaten. Egyptians experience and so like that. Here, these are Morsi's supporters chasing, they chase them from downstairs, from the street. So the kids went up there, and they're trying to hide up there. So this is one of Morsi's supporters carrying a Qada flag, black flag, and they started like, and this is like July 6th, because everyone talks about the camps and the army moving into the camps. But they don't know what made people actually go to the streets on July 26th, demanding that the army moves into the camps. Basically, the kids up there were asking for mercy, but instead of just leaving them, they start throwing stones at them, and then they end up going up there and throwing the kids from the top of that area where they're trying to hide. This, in my opinion, was the immediate cause for the crisis. Morsi's dictatorship, undemocratic rule, and the acts of his supporters against his opponents. That's what made many people who took to Tahrir, this picture with the Tahrir, basically raised a picture saying Muhammad Morsi Mubarak. Muhammad Morsi, and the other guy's name was Muhammad Hosni Mubarak. And basically showing that they were like, they split the picture and that they were the same. So that basically, that people's aspirations, all the hopes that people had after Mubarak was actually toppled, were crashed when Morsi came to power, because he continued the same neoliberal policies that Mubarak was implementing. He also pursued the same and maintained the same strategic alliance with the US and the relationships with Israel. That's the picture of Morsi Mubarak. The other picture you have an Egyptian peasant. I can tell that he's a peasant from the robes from the galabiyas that he's wearing. And if you can see, he has a beard, because in the West they usually consider that people who have beards to be all Islamists, but actually he's a pious Muslim who just has a beard. And you have some pictures of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the current commander of the army, and next to him the picture of Gamal Abdel Nasser. He was leader and the hero of Egypt's independence. And he was the leader of the 23rd of July revolution. And under his picture it says 23rd of July. And under under Sisi's picture it says 30th of June. And then it says a heroic commander under Sisi, disciple or student of a heroic commander. Basically what's going on in Egypt at the moment, in my opinion, is a confrontation between Egyptian and Arab nationalists on one hand and the Islamists on the other hand. It's not about democracy, it's not about like pro-democratic, pro-Morsi supporters about a rising military dictatorship. At the end, I'll share with you pictures to show the kind of support that Sisi, the commander of the army, has in Egypt. Morsi, from the very beginning, here there are two coups. One was made in 2012, shortly after he was declared winner in the election, and the other one was made last June 2013, by one of Nasser, you saw Nasser's picture, by one of his sons in Tahrir, in the same location that Morsi gave his speech. In the speech that Morsi gave, he tried to construct a new narrative of Egypt's history. Basically, he tried to reduce Egyptian history to the history of the Muslim Brotherhood. He started by talking about Egypt's history starting in the 20s of the last century. Anyone who knows a little bit about the history of the Muslim Brotherhood knows that the Muslim Brotherhood was established at that point. So basically he dismissed at least a century of what in the Egyptian national narrative is considered Egyptian Renaissance and awakening, and the awakening of Egyptian and Arab nationalism. When he came to talk about the 60s, because Nasser ruled during the 50s and the 60s, and for many Egyptians, especially workers, peasants, and the middle class, the 50s and the 60s are considered the golden age of Egyptian and Arab nationalism. It's when Egypt became independent, when the British were forced to evacuate Egypt, when the monarchy was abolished and the republic was declared, when agrarian reform was implemented, when Egypt started its industrialization. But at the same time, in the 60s, Nasser clashed with the Muslim Brotherhood. And it was a major clash. And the Muslim Brotherhood basically got smashed in the 60s. So Muhammad Morsi said in the speech, he said the 60s, you cannot imagine what kind of times the 60s were. According to the Muslim Brotherhood, not according to the Egyptian people. A year later, this was on June 28th of 2013, which was like a dress rehearsal for the big demonstrations on June 30th. This was a Friday. In Tahrir, one of Nasser's sons asked where the clan of Hassan al-Banna was. Hassan al-Banna is the founder of the Muslim Brotherhood, and he referred to it as a clan because Morsi used in all his speeches to address his clan. He used to talk about Ahli wa Ashirti, my clan. He wasn't addressing the Egyptian people. He was addressing the Muslim Brotherhood supporters. So therefore, Nasser's son asked where was the clan of Hassan al-Banna to see the children and grandchildren of Nasser. And once he made the statement, everyone in Tahrir raised the pictures of Nasser and chanted his name. So in many respects, these two statements summarize, in my opinion, what's going on in Egypt. That this clash between two narratives and two visions about the society, the identity of the society and the identity of the Egyptian state, not about democracy. Here are the two conflicting visions, the main differences between them. Egyptian and Arab nationalism separation between state and mosque. Political Islam, a religious state, their goal is to establish a religious state that's governed by divine law. Egyptian and Arab nationalists, no discrimination on religious basis. And in fact, like the history of Egyptian and Arab nationalism is full with Christian leaders of both Egyptian and Arab nationalism. For the Islamists, of course, they want to have some type of discrimination between Muslims and non-Muslims. Basically, that non-Muslims cannot run for certain offices, especially presidency. The end goal of Egyptian and Arab nationalists is an independent nation state. Now, for Egyptian nationalists, they're happy with just an Egyptian nation state. For Arab nationalists, they aspire to form an Arab nation state, not just an Egyptian one. For political Islam, the end goal is a caliphate. And it's actually not the end goal. The end goal for the Muslim Brotherhood, according to their doctrine and their teaching, is world hegemony, Ustaziyyat al-Alam, to become masters and teachers of the world. That's the end goal of the Muslim Brotherhood. These two currents in Egyptian politics have clashed several times in the past. The first clash occurred during the 40s. At that point, Egypt was still a monarchy and was occupied by the British. This is way because in the narrative of the Islamists, especially the Muslim Brotherhood, they always argue that they used to be peaceful organization until they clashed with Nasser, and as a result of the clash with Nasser, they became radicalized. But if we actually go really over their history, we find that the first wave of Islamist attacks occurred during the 1940s. They carried out attacks against state officials, assassinated a number of them, including a judge, and ending with the assassination of the prime minister. At that point, Egypt was a monarchy, so the prime minister was the highest state official. They attacked non-Muslim Egyptians, blew up their apartment buildings where they lived, blew up a number of their stores. At the end, and as a result of the assassination of the prime minister, the Muslim Brotherhood got dissolved, and its founder, Hassan al-Banna, got assassinated by the state. When Nasser came to power and led the revolution of the 23rd of July and toppled the monarchy and forced the British to evacuate Egypt, at the beginning he had a short honeymoon with the Muslim Brotherhood. In fact, Sayyid Qutb, the most prominent ideologue of the Muslim Brotherhood, used to be an advisor for the Revolutionary Commanding Council on labor affairs. So there was a short honeymoon until the Muslim Brotherhood tried to assassinate Nasser in 1954. This led to the first clash between Nasser and the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood got banned, several of their members got arrested, and like 6 or 7 of their leaders who were accused of organizing the assassination attempt were executed. Sayyid Qutb was among those who got imprisoned first in 1954. In the early 60s, he was released from prison. He tried to reorganize the Muslim Brotherhood and came up with a new doctrine that basically considered the Egyptian state to be an infidel state, and they aimed to topple the Nasserist regime. Once again, the Muslim Brotherhood was crushed, and Sayyid Qutb ended up being executed. With Sadat, it was a long honeymoon between Sadat and the Muslim Brotherhood. Sadat, because he had decided to actually change the orientation of the economic and social and foreign policy of Egypt under Nasser, so instead of having a kind of quasi-socialist orientation, he decided to encourage the private sector and privatize the public sector, and he decided to end the alliance that Nasser had formed with the Soviet Union and form a strategic alliance with the US and Israel, and he needed the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamists to support him against Nasserist and Marxist opposition. And during the 70s, the state basically devoured its children. Like the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups were allowed to get armed, and they started attacking leftist, the Marxist and Nasserist students on campuses. And the state, most of these students were actually graduates of the youth organization of the Arab Socialist Union, which was the Nasserist party during the era of Nasser. Sadat's era ended with his assassination at the hand of some more radical Islamist group, the Islamic group and the Jihad. 1981, 2011, this was Mubarak's era. Basically, the Muslim Brotherhood enjoyed quasi-official status. Although officially it was banned, but it was allowed to run in parliamentary elections. It was allowed to run in the elections of syndicates and of unions, and was allowed to win, actually, for a long time, at least until the early 90s in terms of unions and syndicates. But while the Muslim Brotherhood enjoyed this quasi-official status, the state, I'm sorry, there's an extra S, the state clashed with the jihadist groups. Jihadist groups like the Islamic group and Islamic Jihad. These two groups launched a military campaign against the state, especially in Upper Egypt and the south. And dozens, and if not hundreds of Egyptians got either killed or maimed by the bombing campaigns that they launched and by the attacks that they launched against state officials. In one attack, they even targeted the prime minister at that point, and they kind of knew the way he took to his office, and it passed in front of a school of children, and yet they put the bomb in front of this children's school in an attempt to assassinate this prime minister. He survived the attack, but one of the girls at the school died as a result of that attack. While the security forces were winning the battle against the Islamists in the 90s, and at the end forced the Islamists at the end of the 90s to declare a ceasefire, Mubarak had started seriously the structural adjustment program and started privatizing the public sector. As a result of the structural adjustment program, the state withdrew to a great extent from the area of social services and stopped providing social services and subsidies that the poor depended on. At the same time, there was a rise of Western-funded civil society. Mubarak allowed and both the privatization and the rise of the Western-funded civil society weakened the grip of the state and the role of the state in society. In order to fill the vacuum created by the withdrawal of the state, the Mubarak regime allowed the Muslim Brotherhood and the Salafis, other groups of Islamists, to actually fill this vacuum and to create a lot of charity organizations. At that point, the society abandoned the state and stopped providing it with legitimacy and support, and as a result, Morsi ended up coming to power. The turning point and the return of the state, the first turning point was what happened in December 2012, when Morsi issued his decree that I talked about earlier, and the demonstrations took place, and he tortured, his supporters tortured, as you saw, and interrogated and beat protesters at the gates of the presidential palace. Turning point 2 was in January of this year, the Port Said massacre. Port Said is a city in the canal zone. People were protesting some kind of ruling made by a court, and Morsi just ordered the state security forces, or he allowed the security forces, it's hard to say that he ordered, but at least he allowed the security forces to actually open fire on people, killing dozens of protesters on that day. Turning point 3 was the making of an Islamist constitution. that basically paved the road to turning Egypt into a theocracy, because it allowed an unelected religious body to actually block, among other things, to block the issuing of any law if they saw that it was against Sharia. And I'll show some of these articles of this constitution later. Turning point 4 was the beginning of the Tamarrud rebel campaign, which was basically a campaign to collect signatures demanding early presidential elections, which Morsi ignored. Of the articles, these are the 4 main problematic articles in the constitution that they issued, and at the moment there are attempts to remake and to some kind of come up with a new constitution. A new assembly was formed last week that's supposed to amend the current constitution that got suspended. And these are the 4 main problematic articles. Article 2, this article was put in the constitution by Sadat. This wasn't put in by the Islamists. Before Sadat made Sharia the principal source of legislation, Sharia was only one of the sources of legislation. But Sadat, because he wanted to, close to the end of his presidency, close to the end of his life, he wanted to amend the constitution to allow himself to run for a 3rd term. Because according to the constitution that existed then, he could only rule for 2 terms. So in order to get the people to approve this change in the constitution, this amendment, especially the Islamists, he made Sharia as a principal source of legislation. Now, the other 3 articles were introduced by the Islamists in the now suspended constitution. The problem was Article 3, although it appears to be giving Christians and Jews, Egyptian Christians and Jews, recognizing and giving them some kind of religious freedoms. But the problem was that it starts dividing, one of the problems that starts dividing the Egyptian society into sects, into religious sects. The other problem is, by only talking about Christians and Jews, you basically exclude groups like the Baha'is, for instance. It's a small community in Egypt, but it exists. The other problem is, by limiting the principles in which the Egyptian Christians and Jews can depend on their own, on Christianity or on Judaism, to only personal status law and religious affairs and selection of their spiritual leaders, it means that if the Islamists decide to actually implement hudud, Islamic penal code, then it will be implemented on the Christians and the Jews as well, although they don't believe in this code. This one is from the English translation. It says that Al-Azhar, which is the religious, Al-Azhar senior scholars, Al-Azhar is a religious institution, scholars are to be consulted in matters pertaining to Islamic law. So since it's Sharia is the main principle of legislation, and that the Islamic scholars are to be, it's written consulted, but basically they have the right to block it, because once they say that it's against Sharia, the law will not be passed. And this already happened during Morsi's presidency, when actually Morsi's supporters tried to pass a law, and it was the senior scholars of Al-Azhar who deemed that this law was against Sharia, so the law was blocked. But here's the thing, that at the moment, the rector of Al-Azhar is a very open-minded religious figure. But if someone else was to be in his position, then we're really moving towards a theocracy. The last article, 219, it talks about accepting the Sunni doctrines. So basically, the Egyptian Shia community, which is also a small community, but it exists, is also excluded from that, and you're going to impose the Sunni understanding of Sharia on the Shia. So basically, we're turning the Egyptian society into a sectarian society. Prospects. Now, the main issue is how to integrate the Islamists in the future political process. There's three scenarios. You either exclude them, and then exclude all of them. And then we're going to witness something similar to what happened in Egypt in the 1980s and the 1990s, when we had this terrorist and bombing campaign that I was telling you about earlier. And this already started. It already started once Morsi was toppled. There's fighting going on in Sina, since July 3rd or July 4th. And today, as I mentioned before, there was an attempt on the life of the Minister of Interior Affairs, and I will share with you, hopefully, the internet will be strong enough to share with you some videos showing Muslim Brotherhood gunmen firing at people in the middle of the street and from bridges and all that. The other possibility will be to have something along the lines of the Algerian model. After the Algerian state clashed with the Islamists in the 90s, they ended up allowing some Islamists, but not like the main Islamist group, to form some kind of parties and to be junior partners in the government. The other model, which I think is very unlikely, is the Turkish model, which is basically to allow a younger generation of the Muslim Brotherhood to participate in elections and to win elections, and to allow them to come to power. I think this scenario is very unlikely unless the economic situation deteriorates it's already bad, but if it becomes worse. But at the moment, and this is one aspect that distinguishes the current confrontation between the Egyptian state and the Islamists from previous confrontation, that the people are actually taking part in this confrontation. And that the majority of the Egyptian people are fed up with the Muslim Brotherhood. And they're not willing, and they don't want to give them another chance. And I will share with you some polls and show you what the people think now. Are linking Sisi to Nasser. Remember the first picture? They're linking Sisi to Nasser. These are the pictures of Sisi and Nasser. Once again, the same thing. And here you notice people in the cities and people in the countryside. There's the Galabeya. Women, veiled women, which are usually portrayed by the Western media as supporters of Islamists. They're the ones who are raising the picture of the Sisi. This is a man who named his newly born son Sisi, after Abdel Fattah Sisi. This is in Suez. An army officer is paying him a visit. Once again, supporters for Sisi in the countryside. And this is in Tahrir, these are the pictures in Tahrir. Different generations. Once again, these two older ladies are wearing a poster with Nasser's picture on it and Sisi's picture underneath it. And above Nasser's picture, it says Ziman, and above Sisi's picture, the son of the man. The man. It says a ducker. A ducker, yes. The man is rounded, but the ducker is the real man. The real man. The real deal. And this is the son of the real deal. These are the pictures of also. Here you find also once again a woman. From her dress you can tell the one who's wearing the veil, the black one, that she's from a humble social background. She's carrying this picture. One from middle class or upper middle class, who's not wearing the veil, also carrying these pictures. This is the one that I love. This is my favorite one because it shows how political myth is created. This is a picture that's distributed like among the users of social networks in Egypt and in the press. This is a picture of Nasser, and this is a child. And now people are saying that this was actually Sisi as a child, saluting Nasser. I love this picture because this is how political myth is created. And the next two pictures are the ones that will probably get the attention of most of Americans and interest you the most. It's basically pictures of Nasser. The pictures are of Nasser and Khrushchev. while in the site of the building of the Haida, picture of Sisi, picture of Putin, and above it says, bye-bye America, bye America, and Nasser, Sisi, Putin, again. And this is what the American media doesn't notice, that for many Egyptians, what's going on at the moment is their second, I wouldn't call it war, but it's their second independence. The thing is that the gap between the Islamist rhetoric, especially when it came to the relationship with the US, and what they really did by cementing this alliance, made many people actually side against them. And now the US is talking, like in the Congress, they're talking about actually terminating aid to Egypt. In Egypt at the moment, people are collecting signatures to demand that the Egyptian government stop receiving aid from the US. And people are talking about restoring or recreating an alliance with Russia similar to the one that Egypt had with the Soviet Union in the 50s and the 60s. Notice in the corner there is an Islamist armed man standing there. And this is the same tactics that were used in Syria, having gunmen hiding in the midst of unarmed civilians and then firing, and when the army fires back, accusing the army at shooting at unarmed civilians. The same tactics that were used initially in Syria. The guy will come out and open fire.
And you're saying he's the one standing on the corner of the sidewalk?
He's hiding here, and then will come out from here and open fire. Was a Kalashnikov, but
I was taken as well.
yeah, do you see the guys? These are not unarmed protesters. And then there's another one. By other branch of Islam, are you talking Sunni, Shia, Alawis, and all stuff? No. The case in Egypt is like the overwhelming majority of Egyptians are Sunnis. So, but it's not a sectarian question. For most Egyptians, it's a national question, not sectarian.
And I know they recently
Salafiyya, they are against the
Do you mean Salafis?
Against the Brotherhood.
Yeah.
Salafis are also Sunnis, but they're against the Muslim Brotherhood for other reasons.
I know, but didn't they also recently take over a mosque and they were like...
No, these were Muslim Brotherhood. These were Muslim Brotherhood. The mosque in Ramses. I'll show you like a picture from the mosque, a video from a mosque in Ramses, where a dead or severely injured person rises up from the desk. And he will open fire too.
Were they shooting? When was it started?
They're shooting, we don't know exactly who's standing on the other side.
Into the crowd.
They're shooting into a crowd, there might be security forces, but the fact that none of them is trying to hide here behind the building or running away, or that none of them has fallen, indicates to me that there were no security forces on the other side shooting at them. Because see, no one is falling.
Because in Arabic it says that they're shooting
At the security. Therefore, like on the side, we don't see it exactly. But the fact that no one has fallen from them shows clearly that no one on the other side is firing back.
Yeah.
No one on the other side is firing back. Have you seen anyone falling? Have you seen anyone falling down? I'll show you another one. All these people are standing in the open. All these people are standing in the open. No one is. The only one who's hiding in the corner is the one who has the gun.
In Egypt?
It's not going to be a military state.
Okay.
The military has no intention of ruling, at least directly.
Okay.
They have no intention. The problem is let me share with you some numbers. Why is it at one point the military might end up actually ruling? These are polls. This is a poll conducted by an American research company here. When it comes to level of confidence, I would focus more on the silent, disaffected plurality, okay, Because the other ones are talking about like political perspective, and the majority of the people belong to the last category. The army, confident, 93. The presidency, this was conducted April-May. The presidency, non-confident, 96%. The Freedom and Justice Party and the Muslim Brotherhood, 100% not confident. The National Salvation Front, the organized secular opposition, 100% not confident. The Noor Party, which is the Salafi, the other Islamist party, 100% not confident. The April 6th movement, which is like a secular youth group, 100% not confident. So we have here a problem in the political system, that no party, if you look at, for instance, when it comes to individuals, the leader who scored the highest in terms of credibility, Gamal Abdel Nasser, someone who died like 40 years ago, 94%. Notice Hosni Mubarak got 30, while Morsi got 3. Ahmed Shafir, who ran against Morsi, got 38. Hamdin Sabbahi, the Nasserist candidate, 35. Muhammad al-Barada is a liberal leader, 23. Abdul Manam Abu Futuh, the Islamist, 33. So basically, we're talking about a political system where that is not trusted. All political parties are not trusted by the people. The people is placing its trust in the army. What the army most likely will do they will try to support a couple of parties to actually win next elections. They decided from the beginning that they're not going to go to the IMF to seek a loan from the IMF. Morsi was negotiating a loan with the IMF. The current interim government that was put in place by the army stopped these negotiations. If they can get the funding, what seems to be very likely is that they will implement a policy of minimum wage and maximum wage. So their economic and social policies will try to move a little bit away from the neoliberal model. But how far depends on if they'll be able to get funding from other sources than the IMF.
In Gulf states, really, they were
Gulf
very generous.
states, yeah. Some Gulf states, like
United Arab Emirates,
United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia,
they
Kuwait,
really put a lot of money.
like 12 billion.
Yeah.
So there is money, but the economic problems are really deep, and it's going to take some time to work on it. When it comes to the relationship with the US, I believe also that the current government will start to move away from this alliance with the US. Already, Egypt declared more than once now in the last 3 days that it opposes any American attack on Syria. They also, I think that today, the interim president met with a delegation from Congress and reiterated Egypt's opposition to an attack on Syria. I believe in terms of foreign policy, Egypt will try to really get closer to Russia and China. And if the US ends up, terminating the aid that it gives to Egypt, then we're talking about terminating the peace treaty with Israel.
And the canal.
The canal?
The canal, yeah. It's, U.S. leverage. It's like Israel's security and the Swiss canal. Yes, we get $1.5 billion, but still, they need us. The U.S. needs Egypt more than Egypt needs $1.5 billion.
Yes, so basically, this is what at the moment, the military it's not getting involved directly, hasn't issued a platform of policies. But based on the discussions that have been taking place, this is where I believe Egypt is heading in terms of economic and social policies. For the first time, people are talking about what they call a tax on wealth. This was the first time after Morsi was removed. While Morsi was in power, the maximum that people were talking about was a minimum wage and maximum wage. Now they're talking about imposing a tax on wealth. Just if you own more than, like they're talking now about 10 million Egyptian pounds, that you're going to have to pay a certain tax just on this wealth. But it's still, quite frankly, it's not clear. If Sisi decides to run, I don't think that he's going to run this time. He might run next time, but if he decides to run, he's going to win. He's going to win with a landslide. It's going to be done deal.
We saw the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood post-Arab Spring, and a big part of it is because of Qatar's support and Turkey's support, political and financial support. And we saw that in Libya, Egypt, and there, I agree with
Syria.
In Syria. So what are Qatar's strategies and Turkey's strategies? What are they trying to do to the region? Because I know in Libya, they literally, Qatar made sure the army is dissolved and the militias are in control. The other question is, removing Morsi by SCAF. I mean, yeah, SCAF now they're popular, but right before Morsi got elected, they weren't popular. And isn't there a clause in the constitution to impeach him? Because this is setting a precedent in the region. I know in Libya, protests after removing Morsi, protests to remove the parliament, and in Tunisia, and some parts of Tunisia too. So why didn't they impeach him rather than having SCAF remove him?
Because there was no clause in the constitution that would allow to impeach him on these conditions. What the constitution, the now suspended constitution, allowed for was a call for early elections or for a referendum. And the only one who, according to this constitution, and we need to keep in mind that this constitution was written by Morsi's supporters, was made by Morsi's supporters. The only person who had the power to call for such a referendum or to call for early presidential elections was Morsi himself. That's why the people collected signatures, and when he insisted on ignoring this demand, the army felt the need to intervene. Now when it comes to Qatar, as you mentioned before, like Qatar made sure that the Libyan army got totally destroyed.
Absolutely.
And that they made sure that no Libyan army will be, a new army will be built or anything. And the West did the same in Iraq. And they're trying to do the same with the Syrian army. So people in Egypt are quite aware of that.
So what are they
So
trying
therefore,
to do?
therefore, the people are really mobilized around the army. And I think that because Sisi and most of the current leadership of the army were served either on the former SCAF, which is the Supreme Council of Armed Forces, or were the second in command in SCAF. They are aware that if they will rule directly, they're going to have to deal with all these economic problems themselves, and they're going to be held accountable for this situation. Therefore, I think this is one of the reasons why they're not going to rule directly. They will tell civilians, you rule, you solve these problems, and the army will stay on the side as a protector of the republic and of the people. I think this is how they want the people to see them, as protectors of the republic and the people, but not as rulers.
Awesome. But isn't the kind of reality is that it is like a military government in the sense that it's a Praetorian state, where you just have a military that is just selecting who is their civilian representatives in government? And doesn't that undermine like any sort of democratic practice within Egypt?
This is the current interim government, but there are going to be presidential and parliamentary elections in a few months. But once a new constitution is issued and is made, you're going to have, and this is like, there's a schedule for it. So by January, I think according to the announced schedule, that by January there are going to be some parliamentary and presidential elections.
But doesn't it, I mean, but isn't there like a pattern that can be recognized? Because they've been talking about Egypt, like Amos Petterman's been talking about since 1974, that Egypt is this Praetorian state where it just keeps selecting. So doesn't it seem like that just overthrowing of Morsi is just a continuation of the Praetorian process that goes on in Egypt.
But this assumes that Morsi's rule was democratic and that he respected the rules of democracy. This assumes this because the question is based on the assumption that the democratic transition had started in Egypt and that the election of Morsi was a step in the right direction. But Morsi's rule actually was totally undemocratic. This was the main problem. This was the main problem. And this also answers Moaz's question, the fact that the secular opposition sided with the Muslim Brotherhood and sided with Morsi during the elections. Morsi won with the vote of the secular opposition. In the first round of the presidential elections, Morsi got only 25% of the vote. Only 25% of the vote in the first round. In the second round, he won with 1 point something or 2 point something margin over Shafiq. And these were the votes of the secular opposition. What happened at the, like last June, that the secular opposition decided to abandon Morsi. And when they noticed it, and the secular opposition itself, as you shown in this poll, that was conducted by an American research company, not by an Egyptian. Even the secular opposition doesn't have that much weight. But everyone is supporting the army. So if we're talking about democracy as being the rule of the people and what the people want, if the Egyptian people want the army to lead, will it be democratic to respect this choice? Or does the army, if the people want the army to rule, if democracy is like respecting the will of the majority, and if the majority wants the army to rule. Now this might sound strange for like Americans, but if the army is the most popular actor and institution in the country, I can guarantee you if Sisi decides to run, he will win. He will win like, it's really like, you will get at least 87% of the vote. Without any kind of rigged elections or anything. Therefore, Sisi had announced that Egypt was willing to get international monitors to observe any coming elections. The guy is very, 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 very popular. But he will not run for president.
Isn't part of why the Muslim Brotherhood got elected is because it was the only organized institution after Mubarak?
That's one of the...
They had the organization.
You only have 2 organized groups in Egypt. The army and the Muslim Brotherhood. These are the only 2 organized groups in Egypt. And this is the reality. And for most Egyptians, they would prefer the rule of the military over the rule of the Muslim Brotherhood. It sounds, I'm sure it sounds very strange for Americans. But this is how it is in Egypt. And Sisi depends on his popularity in defying the US. And he knows that the more he defies the US, the more popular he will become. He knows that. And he knows that every time Obama holds or stops delivering weapons to Egypt, that he will become more popular.
How come United Arab Emirates from Western really support the army
And Saudi
Arabia?
I think it has to do with, see, personally I don't believe in such a thing called the Arab Spring. Okay? I believe more that it was a new conservative, neocon spring in the region. And that there are 2 versions of it. A Qatari-Turkish version that is based on helping the Muslim Brotherhood to come to power in the region and to have the Muslim Brotherhood being dependent on the political, as Moaz mentioned, political and financial support of Turkey and Qatar, and getting the US to accept this kind of version. And another version that's supported by Saudi Arabia, and basically someone like Bandar bin Sultan, the head of the intelligence, which is basically about destroying the region and counts more on Salafi and jihadist groups, like what's going on in Syria at the moment. And the first version, the Turkish Qatari one, presented the threat to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia bases its role and the legitimacy of the entire kingdom on them being the representatives of Sunni Islam. So having the Muslim Brotherhood in power in Egypt, the seat of Al-Azhar, with the role and the influence of Al-Azhar on Sunni Muslims all over the world, will threaten it presents a threat to Saudi legitimacy and monopoly over the right to speak in name of Sunnis. If we add to this the Turkish model as an economic model, as being more prosperous and a more open society than Saudi, the Saudi society and the Saudi economic model, I see why Saudi Arabia would oppose the Muslim Brotherhood coming to power in Egypt, but would not oppose the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamist groups destroying Syria. And UAE, I think it might be the influence of Saudi Arabia plus their own interest. UAE had always had good relationships with Mubarak. And they might be afraid of the Muslim Brotherhood trying to take over also in UAE.
That's right. They formed
There was a
They formed the
group
group.
of Muslims, a couple of Muslim Brotherhood cells that were arrested in UAE and were put on trial because they were accused of trying to overthrow the government in UAE.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak for a second on what the army and what I know the Muslim Brotherhood, I'm sure, is supporting the FSA and whatnot, especially looking at like 1982. Hafiz al-Assad destroyed the Muslim Brotherhood uprising. And if you could speak also on kind of the difference between the FSA and some of the al-Qaeda groups that have kind of joined in on that, and what Egypt has to say about the struggle for freedom and the dictatorship in Syria.
Okay. When Morsi was in power, he terminated Egypt's relationships with Syria. And he gave a speech in which he announced that the Egyptian people and the army support the anti-Assad uprising. And this, when he did that, this was also one of the turning points, especially for the army, because you need to keep
Sorry, this might have nice.
You need to keep in mind that the Egyptian army and Egyptian people in general considers the Syrian army like comrades in arms. The Egyptian army and the Syrian army fought together several wars against Israel. And Egypt and Syria were at one point one state under the United Arab Republic. So there are very strong pro-Syrian feelings in Egypt, in the army and in society. And therefore both the army and the society, I haven't seen a single op-ed in an Egyptian paper supporting the American attack on Syria. Everyone is against the army, the government, the political forces, the media, everyone is opposing an American attack on Syria. And it's very likely that when, and I'm not saying if, when an American attack on Syria occurs, that the US would lose whatever influence it still has in Egypt. Now, when it comes to what's going on in Syria, for many people in Egypt, they believe that what's going on in Syria is basically a Qatari-Saudi plot to undermine Bashar al-Assad. No one thinks of Bashar al-Assad as being a democratic leader. But everyone knows that the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamist groups that are fighting against Bashar in Syria are not democratic groups either. What all the different political forces in Egypt have been calling for is a political settlement in Syria that would allow the Syrian people to decide for themselves whom they want to. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Dr. Bassem, so do you think part of Emirates is supporting this campaign against Syria is because they want to remove the Halawi Shia? Because Saudi, they don't like Muslim Brotherhood or Shia?
I think it has to do also with Syria's alliance with Iran
Right,
and with Hezbollah,
right.
and how this alliance undermines Saudi influence in Iraq and in Lebanon. I think the Saudis are also worried that if the Islamist jihadists don't move into fighting into Syria, they end up moving into Saudi Arabia because they have a joint border, so they prefer to have them killing Syrians and getting killed by the Syrian army than them moving into Saudi Arabia. I think it's a number of reasons.
What do you think is going to happen with the treaty with Israel? I mean, both sides have been pretty mum on, how things are going to progress in the future, if they're going to change, stay the same.
See, at the moment, there's a lot of fighting going on in Sinai between the army and Islamist army groups there. One of the problems that has been hindering the movement of the Egyptian army is that under this peace treaty with Israel, the peace treaty puts limits on the number of troops and the kind of weapons that could be deployed in Sinai. So many people have been calling for, if not cancelling, terminating the treaty, at least amending the security part of it, security protocol. Now here's the question, would Israel accept that or not? So if Israel doesn't accept it, and at one point the Egyptian army would feel that it needs to get into that area, because if you cannot move your troops in that area, it will become like a safe haven for these Islamist groups. So at one point the army will move in there. Now, everything will depend on the Israeli reaction. At that point, things will depend on the Israeli reaction. And it also, the future of the treaty depends on what the US will decide regarding aid to Egypt. If the US terminates its aid to Egypt, so it's very likely that the treaty will get terminated.
Support from non-American elements for economic stability to return to Egypt? I mean, right now there seems to be plenty of money coming in from other Gulf states. Russia could possibly step in and start providing military aid, but is there enough money for them to replace American and other Western?
The U.S., by the way, gives only, in terms of economic aid, the U.S. gives $200 to $300 million in economic aid. That's nothing.
Right.
200 to 3. The issue with the aid, the real issue with the aid is the spare parts and ammunition for the weapons. Mm-hmm. It's not the economic aspect. It's about spare parts for the weapons and ammunition for the weapons.
As far as non-government investment, though, like corporate investments?
There isn't much.
Okay.
UAE and Saudi Arabia invest more, even in terms of private companies and all that. UAE and Saudi Arabia come first.
But with all the instability right now, it's really hard for investors to go in there, right? Is that part of why Egypt is facing a financial problem?
Of course, with the instability, and this is part of the Muslim Brotherhood plan, is to prolong the instability to weaken the government. So in order to be able to come back to power, but I don't think that this plan will work. UAE is determined to support Egypt financially, more so even than Saudi Arabia. And I think last few days, the current Libyan Minister of Foreign Affairs was in Egypt, and they might also provide some help.
They give $2 billion in oil.
Yeah, so there are other sources.
So for the United States to keep Egypt, if not an ally, then maybe not a new non-ally, we need to talk with them and say, we understand what you're going through, we'll continue the aid, we'll also support the military's efforts in bringing stability to the region.
don't know, the US can do whatever it wants.
Well,
The US can do whatever it wants. I'm not here to speak for the US.
okay, would Egypt accept something like that from the United States?
They might. They might. The government might. I don't know. But at the moment, the issue is like, really, especially the economic aid is worth nothing. We're talking about 200, 300 million dollars, and most of it goes anyway to the private sector and human rights organizations funded by the US, the civil society, the Western funded civil society. So if the US cuts the economic aid, it's going to hurt its partners. It's going to hurt the private sector and the Western funded civil society, not so much the government.
And then don't you have like, Egypt is protecting Israel's security, and the U.S. uses the
airspace,
in the Suez Canal, the oil comes from there.
Yeah, so not just the oil, the American warships that pass through the Suez Canal, American warplanes that pass in Egyptian airspace, so yeah, there's a lot that the U.S. has to lose. There's a lot for the U.S. to lose.
It's then forming the main part of politics. Is it possible that U.S. helps Egypt through EU?
The problem is that both the U.S. and EU want to contain the influence of the army in the country.
To get rid of Islamists, as many people in the Arabic countries say, now the West get rid of Islamic rule in Arabic countries.
The Western gets rid of Islamic rule.
Such as the one Morsi rule.
But the West doesn't use it.
Most, right? At least I heard that in Geneva, and they say that.
But the army.
They said that secrets, it's fourth of politics is secret.
I don't think like the EU will help. The EU is Egypt's major trade partner. So if the EU stops the trade with Egypt, the EU has also a lot to lose. Whatever Egypt is getting from the EU, Egypt can get it for a lesser price from China. So the only problem will be that Egypt also exports some agricultural products to the EU. But every side will have something, will lose something in this process. It all depends on the political and economic orientation of the new regime. And this, until now, it's not clear. But like EU, US, I don't think so. If the regime decides to move towards building an alliance with China and Russia, then there isn't much the EU and the US can do.
They care about stability in Egypt, even if on the media they are not on a good term with Egypt. But the main purpose is to get Egypt stable. And that's why maybe the army now hit the militia in Sinai.
We're talking about a country of close to 90 million people. We don't want to have a mess in such a place.
Yes, that's
90 million people.
Yeah.
90 million people.
How many people live in Cairo, Ken?
22. 22 million. Okay. So we're talking about 90 million.
Yes.
I'm from
You
Libya.
don't want to
Libya,
have
all
a
of
mess
this
in such a place.
Yes.
Where you have, as Maaz was saying, Suez Canal, you have like a joint border with the Israelis. All this, you don't want to have mess.
That's right.
And if there's a mess in Egypt, plus in Libya, then Algeria is going to be next, Mali, all this area is going to be next. You destabilize all of North Africa. And then we're talking about immigration to the EU countries and all of that. It's going to be a mess. I don't think anyone wants to see a mess there, but also the US and the EU don't want to see the army in power. Because the army is the only actor that doesn't need their support that much. The so-called civil society depends on Western funding. The private sector depends on aid also from the EU and from the US. The army, yes, it receives still like weapons from the US, but in the last 4 or 5 years, even when Mubarak was still in power, Egypt started buying weapons again from Russia. So if the US pressures the army too much, the army will just decide to get weapons from China and Russia. Of course, it will take time to replace all the existing systems, but it's going to happen.
Egypt is so strategic, even to the Middle East. Like,
Yeah.
for instance, Libya, the Gulf countries, all the professors, education, they're all Egyptian. So it's kind of, the Libyan military is being, well, there's no military, but it's being trained by the
Right now,
Egyptians.
right now, even the new one.
The new one, yeah. Even the past when Gaddafi had that revolution, it was trained by Egypt. So where Egypt goes, there's an Arabic saying, the whole Arab countries go.
And this is what also the army is trying to do, like, because the weakest point in the Egyptian strategy is the border with Libya, because it's a very long border that cannot be controlled, and if Egypt's going to be attacked by Islamists it's most likely that they're going to be attacked through the Libyan border. Therefore, Egypt has been trying to help the new regime in Libya to rebuild an army in order to protect this border, to help in protecting the border, and in order to help in rebuilding the Libyan state. I don't have any more questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.